overbooking isn't illegal. Airlines can bump you from a flight, but rules require the company to compensate you.
The summer is winding down. Perhaps you've got time for one more trip before fall arrives. If you jump on a crowded plane, you may wonder why airlines overbook flights. Well, our Y guy Jerry Carnes is asking the same question.
Buckle up, it's going to be a bumpy ride. Of course, there's no need to buckle up if you're bumped from your flight. It happens. In fact, during the first 3 months of the year, over 100,000 passengers were bumped from flights run by airlines based here in the United States. In most cases, it's because the airline has overbooked the flight, leading a lot of travelers to ask why. Sometimes travelers buy tickets and never show up for their flight. The airlines keep a close watch on which flights have the most no-shows. They use computer software to forecast how many passengers are likely to skip a particular flight. If the computer forecasts, for example, a dozen no-shows, the airline will overbook accordingly to make sure every seat is full. Travel experts say they can predict the number of no-shows with eerie accuracy, but sometimes the airlines are wrong. When everyone shows up for an overbooked flight, the gate agents have to scramble. They start offering travel vouchers, even cash, in an attempt to convince travelers to take another flight. If they can't get enough passengers to vacate voluntarily, they'll start bumping. The content editor of airfarewatchdog.com tells me passengers who paid the most for their tickets are the least likely to get bumped, along with unaccompanied minors and travelers with disabilities. Delta proudly informed us that out of their 32 million passengers the first quarter of the year, only one who wished to stay on their flight got the big bump.
Even if you pay for an airline ticket, the U.S. Department of Transportation says airlines can bump you, no matter how big of an inconvenience it is.
I can't think of another transportation industry that does that, where you have a reserved reservation and you get on the plane and get into your seat, and they have the ability to come in and get you out.
Scott Goldberg is a Fort Myers attorney. He says a similar case in the 80s rewarded a couple $200,000 for bumping them from a flight. But this most recent United case could force airlines to change its procedures.
This case is going to be one that will set the standard, because airlines over many, many years have been overbooking their flights. And they do that for a reason, because they want to fill all their seats.
If you are involuntarily bumped, the Department of Transportation says you deserve a written statement why. But you may be surprised to learn if you can get to your final destination within an hour of your original time, they aren't required to pay you. If you arrive after the check-in deadline, they can bump you without compensation. If the airline has to change the type of plane, there's no requirement to pay you. And if the airline gives you a free ticket or voucher after bumping you without your consent, you can insist on getting a check instead. As for the viral video, United Airlines CEO has issued 3 different apologies, and the Chicago Department of Aviation, whose security officers removed the man off the flight, say the officer who used force is now on leave pending the review of the situation. In the newsroom, Jillian Idle, Fox 4, in your corner.
Okay, thank you, Jillian.
Why are flights overbooked to start with?
Airlines historically have overbooked flights. They do that because they assume that people will no-show. There may be last-minute cancellations.
Brian Murray, travel expert with AAA, says overbooking airlines is as simple as the airline's bottom line.
Once the door of a plane closes, they want to make sure that there's people in the seats, because if they take off with an empty seat, that's lost revenue.
Murray says it's typically legacy airlines such as United, American, and Delta that overbook flights. He says budget airlines like Southwest and JetBlue typically fill seats to capacity. But this travel expert says when a flight is overbooked, an airline will typically start by asking for volunteers before the flight boards to move to another flight. The airline will then randomly select passengers, and Murray says it's your right as a passenger to be compensated.
You have to offer compensation, and there's a schedule of levels of compensation that they're required to offer if they can accommodate you on your ticketed flight.
Murray says an algorithm takes ticket costs, status on an airline, and frequent flyer miles, among other things, into consideration when randomly deciding who is bumped from a flight. In Amherst, Sierra Johnson, 7 Eyewitness News.
Have you ever experienced being bumped? I'm talking about buying a plane ticket, packing your bags, getting to the airport, and then finding out that the airline have deliberately overbooked your flight and you no longer have a seat. Most of us hate when this happens, so why do airlines continue to do it? Airlines have been deliberately overbooking flights for decades. Following the deregulation of the airline industry in 1978, airlines became incentivized to increase the number of passengers on their flights. And they identified one big missed opportunity for more revenue: all those sold but empty seats. In fact, most flights take off without their seats completely filled. Now, for many this may sound greedy, but airlines argue that overbooking is a way for them to provide a long-term sustainable service in a very competitive industry. It helps them weather a number of variables that can affect their profit margins, such as rising labour costs and changing fuel prices. Recently, the International Air Transport Association downgraded its 2019 outlook for the global air industry by more than $7 billion, in large part due to the rising price of jet fuel. So, overselling plane tickets helps airlines maximise profits, but according to industry experts, it also benefits passengers. It gives them more choice and access when booking flights, and lets the airlines charge less for a ticket too. Overbooking, as well as unplanned operational issues, meant that in the US last year more than 380,000 passengers were denied boarding. Most were voluntary, but nearly 12,000 passengers didn't have a choice. When overbooking flights, most airlines use sophisticated revenue management systems to choose which seats to oversell. These systems are powered by AI software that analyzes historical flight data and other variables like date, time, and even special events, enabling airlines to profile the type of fare sold and estimate the number of empty seats there will be. For instance, it may spot an increased risk of no-show passengers on connecting flights, who might miss their connection if their first flight is delayed. There's also a chance that tickets booked speculatively may result in empty seats. For example, large optional group bookings may later end up requiring less seats than expected, which is why airlines will oversell these flights until seats are named and paid for. But the opposite also applies. Once confirmed, group bookings are highly likely to show up, which means the airline's need to overbook will actually reduce. Airlines are also alert to flights with passengers on flexible tickets. These tickets cost more but allow travellers to change their flights without a fee. Usually used by business travellers, flexible tickets are a big reason for airlines overselling flights. There's also a high chance that this type of traveller books flexible tickets on multiple flights to cover their options, leaving at least one seat empty. This was especially true with the Concorde. The supersonic jet could only seat 100 passengers, yet British Airways and Air France reportedly sold up to 130 tickets for each flight, knowing that the majority of passengers were business travellers, booked on flexible tickets, and could change their mind on what flight to catch at the last minute. If BA and Air France hadn't oversold those flights, the empty seats would have been a huge hit to their profitability. Conversely, if the ticket is non-refundable or non-flexible, it's more likely the passenger will turn up. This is often the case for budget carriers. Many of these airlines tend to not overbook as much due to the low rates of no-shows, around roughly 5%. Even with sophisticated airline revenue management systems, empty seats are still an issue for airlines. Last year, the global passenger load factor was 81.9%. That means that on average, planes are flying with almost 20% of its seats empty. You'd be forgiven for thinking the number of people being denied boarding has increased thanks to the many incidents that have gone viral on social media in recent years. But as data gathering and technology have improved, that number has actually been in decline. In 2018, there was a total of 11,835 involuntary denied boardings by the 10 biggest American airlines. That may sound a lot, but it works out as just 0.14 involuntary bumps for every 10,000 passengers booked to fly, the lowest number since records began in 1995. Still, sometimes too many people do turn up for a flight. So what happens then? First, airlines will ask if any passengers are willing to give up their seat, also known as voluntary denied boarding. The vast majority of overbookings in the US last year, around 97%, were solved voluntarily. But if there aren't enough volunteers, airlines will then involuntarily bump passengers at the airport. The criteria for who is denied boarding varies depending on the airline. However, according to some industry experts, you're less likely to get bumped if you're travelling in first class, have an ultra-high status in the airline's frequent flyer program, or you're travelling with your family. If you're travelling alone, one of the last passengers to check in, and bought your ticket last minute or at a cheap fare, then you're more likely to get bumped. And if you are involuntarily denied boarding, there's nothing you can do about it. That's because when you book a flight, you're agreeing to an airline's contract of carriage. The terms and conditions within that contract state that the airline has the right to deny boarding to any passenger they wish. So are passengers at the mercy of airlines? Legislation on passengers' rights vary around the world, so it depends on where you are and which airline you're flying with. If you're flying to or from EU airports on a European airline, you are generally well protected. That's because of the EU's flight compensation regulation. Let's say you've been denied boarding on your Overbook flight from London to Paris. EU law gives you two choices. One is a full refund of the ticket plus a return flight to your original point of departure if you had travelled on a connecting flight. Or you can request to be rerouted to your final destination as soon as possible or at a later date that suits you. Regardless of which option you choose to take or the duration of your delay, you're also entitled to compensation relative to the flight distance. In the US, compensation for being bumped is based on the duration of your delay and whether it is a domestic or international flight. If you were involuntarily bumped off but arrived no more than an hour after your originally scheduled arrival on another flight, you receive no compensation whatsoever. If the airline doesn't organise substitute travel arrangements, then the maximum you can claim is $1,350 on a domestic flight, regardless of whether the cost of the ticket exceeds that amount. Airlines can offer such compensation in cash, travel vouchers, or a combination of the two. You may be surprised to hear that there are passengers who love getting bumped and will intentionally book flights at the busiest times to increase their chances. Some airlines, like American carrier United, offer up to $10,000 compensation for passengers who get bumped. People who need to travel urgently also benefit. They can buy tickets for a departure even though it's theoretically sold out. In addition, filling every seat on a flight helps reduce the environmental impact per passenger at a time when commercial aviation faces criticism for its carbon footprint. As artificial intelligence and algorithms improve, the number of jet setters being denied boarding will continue to decline. But airlines make more money from overselling flights than they do from compensating passengers without seats. And that means the current business model isn't likely to change anytime soon. So don't be surprised the next time you get bumped. Hi guys, thanks for watching our video.
Have you ever sat in a doctor's office for hours despite having an appointment at a specific time? Has a hotel turned down your reservation because it's full? Or have you been bumped off a flight that you paid for? These are all symptoms of overbooking, a practice where businesses and institutions sell or book more than their full capacity. While often infuriating for the customer, overbooking happens because it increases profits while also letting businesses optimize their resources. They know that not everyone will show up to their appointments, reservations, and flights, so they make more available than they actually have to offer. Airlines are the classical example, partially because it happens so often. About 50,000 people get bumped off their flights each year. That figure comes at little surprise to the airlines themselves, which use statistics to determine exactly how many tickets to sell. It's a delicate operation. Sell too few, and they're wasting seats. Sell too many, and they pay penalties. Money, free flights, hotel stays, and annoyed customers. So here's a simplified version of how their calculations work. Airlines have collected years' worth of information about who does and doesn't show up for certain flights. They know, for example, that on a particular route, the probability that each individual customer will show up on time is 90%. For the sake of simplicity, we'll assume that every customer is traveling individually, rather than as families or groups. Then, if there are 180 seats on the plane, and they sell 180 tickets, the most likely result is that 162 passengers will board. But of course, you could also end up with more passengers, or fewer. The probability for each value is given by what's called a binomial distribution, which peaks at the most likely outcome. Now let's look at the revenue. The airline makes money from each ticket buyer and loses money for each person who gets bumped. Let's say a ticket costs $250 and isn't exchangeable for a later flight. And the cost of bumping a passenger is $800. These numbers are just for the sake of example. Actual amounts vary considerably. So here, if you don't sell any extra tickets, you make $45,000. If you sell 15 extras and at least 15 people are no-shows, you make $48,750. That's the best case. In the worst case, everyone shows up. 15 unlucky passengers get bumped, and the revenue will only be $36,750, even less than if you only sold 180 tickets in the first place. But what matters isn't just how good or bad a scenario is financially, but how likely it is to happen. So, how likely is each scenario? We can find out by using the binomial distribution. In this example, the probability of exactly 195 passengers boarding is almost 0%. The probability of exactly 184 passengers boarding is 1.11%, and so on. Multiply these probabilities by the revenue for each case. Add them all up and subtract the sum from the earnings by 195 sold tickets, and you get the expected revenue for selling 195 tickets. By repeating this calculation for various numbers of extra tickets, the airline can find the one likely to yield the highest revenue. In this example, that's 198 tickets, from which the airline will probably make $48,774, almost $4,000 more than without overbooking. And that's just for one flight. Multiply that by 1 million flights per airline per year, and overbooking adds up fast. Of course, the actual calculation is much more complicated. Airlines apply many factors to create even more accurate models. But should they? Some argue that overbooking is unethical. You're charging two people for the same resource. Of course, if you're 100% sure someone won't show up, it's fine to sell their seat. But what if you're only 95% sure? 75%? Is there a number that separates being unethical from being practical?